I'd never heard of a battle in which everybody was killed, but this seemed likely to be an exception. Those words from a British soldier pretty much summed up the Battle of Waterloo. On the 18th of June 1815, the leaders of the Allied European powers were concerned with ending the dominance of France and its leader, Napoleon Bonaparte, once and for all. But most soldiers on the field would have been aware of little more than the men either side of them, and those immediately in front, the smoke, the noise, and the carnage. Whether it was on the end of a musket ball, cannonball, bayonet, sword, or lance, many considered it a simple question of how they'd go out, not if.
As the battle neared its conclusion, men described the very air undulating. Thousands of projectiles ripped into opposing armies.
In this episode, we've joined up with the 42nd Highland Regiment 1815, the legendary Black Watch, to march onto the real Waterloo battlefield in Belgium for the 210th anniversary. Using a range of contemporary sources and a little hands-on experience, we'll try to piece together what the battle was like for ordinary soldiers. I'll discover what hardships the men endured before they even faced the French. Who would be leading them into the depths of hell? What it was like to fight against the most feared of Napoleon's troops, and just how likely it was that you'd make it out alive. Welcome to Survive History, guys. Do not forget to subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. By 1815, it must have seemed like the whole world was weary of war. Napoleon's once mighty European empire had been conquered the previous year in the wake of millions of deaths. And the violence was hardly contained to one continent. Both Moscow and Washington were burned by foreign invaders in 1812, as Britain and France vied for global supremacy. But the war wasn't over yet. Napoleon escaped exile on the island of Elba and swiftly returned home, embraced by a French population eager to regain its former glory. The major European powers were hell-bent on stopping him, agreeing to march on France at the earliest opportunity. Austrians and Russians approached from the east, while the British crossed the Channel to link up with their allies from the Low Countries and Germany, plus a large force of Prussians. By early summer, a growing Allied army was camped in the countryside around Brussels. It was a motley bunch, and the man in charge of it, the British Duke of Wellington, had his doubts about its ability to operate as a single entity.
Only about a third of Wellington's army was actually British, and they mixed uneasily with the European soldiers they'd be fighting alongside. A commonly held view was that the Dutch army would run at the first sign of trouble. German soldiers from Brunswick in their distinctive black uniforms were unpopular partly because of a reputation for eating dog meat. And as for the French-speaking Belgians in camp, many of them were actually veterans of Napoleon's armies.
Indeed, those Belgians were being targeted by pamphlets smuggled across the French border, encouraging them to serve once again under Napoleon's Eagle standards. In response, Wellington split up many of the Europeans and brigaded them with battle-hardened redcoat battalions that had served under him in Spain and Portugal. Though by now, even the best British units, including the Black Watch, were packed with green recruits. It led to misgivings on both sides, and undoubtedly the atmosphere in camp would have grown tense as weeks passed, without much to keep the men occupied beyond drill, drinking, and and card games.
There was no camaraderie amongst the Allied troops, not even amongst the officers. The ignorance of the other's language, on both sides, the major difference in pay, and the resulting great difference in lifestyles prevented any closer companionship.
Some men and officers of the 42nd Highland Regiment were performing at a ball in Brussels on the night of June 16th, when news arrived of Napoleon's lightning advance across the border. Though it was the middle of the night, the soldiers were ordered to march south immediately. Observers noted that the 42nd set out so smoothly that the distinctive ostrich plumes in their bonnets hardly moved. But the 20-mile slog grew more difficult as the heat of the summer day increased. They reached the important crossroads at Qatre at around 3 p.m. There was no chance for rest even here. The men had heard the sound of battle growing louder as they approached, and they were thrown straight into the furnace. The prelude to Waterloo, Qatre was a confusing battle, not just because the front lines changed constantly as new units were fed into the fight, but due to the baffling array of uniforms worn by Napoleonic armies. At one point, the Highlanders gunned down a large number of allied Belgian dragoons, before fatally mistaking French lancers for friendly Germans. They would suffer for their mistake, caught by the enemy cavalry before they were able to close their ranks into a defensive square. Dozens of men were literally skewered. To those unlucky enough to become a casualty, the limitations of the British medical system would quickly become apparent.
If you were wounded on the battlefield, you'd actually have slightly better prospects as a Frenchman, as they'd recognised that speed of treatment was critical to a soldier's survival chances and introduced the flying ambulance. If you were British, you might have to wait hours or even days on the battlefield before being carried off on a makeshift stretcher to the rear, where you'd do more waiting before you got to see an overworked and exhausted surgeon.
Good military surgeons of the day could amputate a limb in less than a minute, but abdominal wounds were usually fatal. In the nick of time, I realised I just had a case of indigestion and was declared fit for duty. Rejoining what remained of the Black Watch, things didn't look particularly good. Almost 300 casualties at Qatre represented half of the regiment's fighting strength, not to mention the painful loss of the commanding officer, Sir Robert Macara, something that would leave them burning for revenge. Fighting didn't finally peter out until 9 p.m, an unbelievable test of endurance for soldiers who had begun marching in the early hours. Though technically a draw, Wellington's army had halted the French advance before it could drive a wedge between the Anglo-Dutch army and the Prussians to the east. But unknown to them, the Prussians had suffered a bruising defeat to Napoleon's army at Ligny, one that might easily have removed them from the war and brought the whole campaign to disaster. A French soldier described the scene after their cannons had obliterated the densely packed Prussian formations.
A vast number of corpses, both men and horses, were scattered about, horribly mutilated by shells and cannonballs. Elsewhere, the dead preserved a human appearance because canister, musket balls and bayonets were practically the only instruments of destruction used. Here, as a contrast, it was limbs and scattered body parts, detached heads, ripped out entrails.
Before long, Wellington's army would come to face those same guns. When the 42nd woke the next morning, they at least had the comfort of knowing their sacrifice had been recognised, being mentioned in the commander's dispatches. And in general, the mutual suspicion between the British and European forces would certainly have eased after enduring a battle shoulder to shoulder. though we still get the sense from eyewitnesses that the Highlanders terrified their allies as much as the French.
The Europeans harboured their own stereotypes about the British, particularly the Scots. After their heroics at Qatre, one soldier of the 92nd recorded using the breastplates of slain French cuirassiers to cook their beef ration, although apparently the bullet holes lost them much of the gravy. Legend has it that some Dutch soldiers who witnessed them around the campfire believed they were cooking slices of dead Frenchmen. I'm just taking a break on the set of a future Survive History video, this time on the Wars of the Roses. Now, with all of the episodes that we do, I often ask the question, if I was actually dropped into the period or the conflict that we cover, would I have the 21st century insights to give my side the advantage? Would I have the technological or medical insights, for example, to advance the course of human history? Well, having this book would certainly help. Because here I've got the book, The Ultimate Guide to Rebuilding Civilization. And it's full of detail on humankind's greatest inventions and innovations and discoveries. But it's not so much a typical history or science book, it's more of a visual journey through the story of innovation. There are chapters on anatomy, festivals, musical instruments, bicycles, 180 topics, over 23 chapters in fact. Now, as a student of military history, I really like these handmade illustrations of early weapons like trebuchets and flintlock muskets. They sort of look like blueprints created in a previous century. The book explores lots of intriguing mechanisms and materials, but alongside technical explanations for things like early tanks, you've got these engineering drawings blended with medieval art styles. You can just tell a lot of creative work went into making this. In fact, over 50 professionals were involved. And it's become incredibly popular, selling over 300,000 copies worldwide and becoming a global bestseller. So if you're looking for a unique gift for the curious mind or a present to yourself, you can get the book at the link in the description now. Now, back to the episode.
It was June 17th, the day before the decisive battle, and Wellington's position was vulnerable. With the Prussians no longer protecting their flank, the Anglo-Dutch army was ordered to retreat 8 miles back towards Brussels to form a new defensive line. The distance wasn't as great as the march south the day before, but it was no more enjoyable. This time the men were trudging in a rainstorm, with the French nipping at their heels, all while dealing with the fatigue of the previous day's fighting. Horse artillery and even rocket fire was used to keep Napoleon's pursuers at bay. The soaked soldiers arrived on the Mont Saint-Jean ridge and were deployed along a 3-mile front, some inside the farmhouses on the forward slope that would serve as Wellington's defensive bastions, Hougoumont, La Haye-Sainte and Papelotte. But most on the reverse slope, keeping them hidden from the French arriving across the valley. For the majority then, there was little cover from the elements beyond hedgerows, ditches, trees, and a few peasant cottages. It seems very few had tents. They spent a miserable evening wandering in search of a place to lie down, competing with thousands of others for the few sheltered spots. The rain began to fall in torrents. The night was very bad. The field where we were was all mud. I got a bundle of straw to lie upon and smeared an old blanket with thick clayey mud, which prevented the rain from passing through and kept me tolerably warm.
Soldiers of the Napoleonic Wars were used to miserable sleeping conditions, but even they found the night of June 17th particularly grim. In the pouring rain with no food to be found, soldiers bedded down in the mud using branches and straw to build rough shelters. It was cold too, so cold in fact that the men garrisoning Louee Dessent pulled down some of the doors to the complex to chop up for firewood, which wasn't exactly going to make it easy to defend.
It may have been even worse for the French, with many soldiers arriving during the night and having no chance to start campfires. Some cavalrymen recorded that they slept on their horses' backs. Everyone would have woken aching, stiff and sodden on the morning of the 18th, though at least the rain had now stopped. Many relied on their tobacco rations to warm them, smoked in clay pipes, while some Highlanders swigged gin to produce the same effect. As for breakfast that day, it seems you were lucky to get much more than a small piece of bread. Thoughts were already turning to the day's events and the contest between the two great generals of the age. The Allied commander gave little away to his immediate subordinates, and the rank and file were, as usual, totally ignorant of his strategic plan. But in an unlikely turn of events, I'd been told Wellington was willing to confide in me.
Rob, I don't think the real Duke of Wellington would be entertaining me in his tent on the morning of the battle, but thank you for showing me your plans.
No problem. He certainly would not be entertaining a lowly Highland private.
I'm very lucky, but perhaps you could tell me, Rob, I think Napoleon has this attitude for being quite reckless with the lives of his soldiers, despite being loved by them. With Wellington, his reputation's maybe a little bit different. What is his attitude towards the soldiery?
Wellington's attitude is he wants to look after them. He's got a very small army of British soldiers. He's commanding an allied army consisting of Dutch, Belgians, Brunswickers, lots of German states. He's a duke, and before that he was viscount, etc. He's upper class, so he wouldn't fraternise with the lower ranks. He's very aloof. He's aloof with his own officers to a certain extent. He was known for being a man of few words, quite reserved, but in intimate company, he could be the life and the soul of the party. He'd got a laugh similar to a neighing horse, apparently.
Well, he probably wasn't laughing on the morning of the battle, right? He's at least chosen the ground, but beyond that, he is relying on help. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, up until the battle, he very much tried to maintain a feeling of calm. Certainly in Brussels. A couple of nights before the battle, he actually attended a ball at the Duchess of Richmond's home. But yes, the morning or the night before Waterloo, I'm sure he had some worries. Would the Prussians arrive in time? It's often thought that the Prussians come to save the day, but the fact is Wellington would not have fought at Waterloo if he didn't know the Prussians were going to assist him at some point.
The Prussians had been mauled at Ligny, but not entirely defeated. Much would depend on the determination of their commander, Marshal Blucher, to reach the Anglo-Dutch army quickly, over difficult terrain, and with a large French force under Marshal Grouchy tasked with delaying them. In the meantime, Wellington's job was to not budge an inch.
He had seen the battlefield of Waterloo at a previous date, right? He knows that the topography here will give him, will buy him time, will give him some advantages against a massive French attack.
Yeah, there's two ridges, one at Mont Saint-Jean and one at La Belle Alliance. And some of the research points that he wanted the ridge at La Belle Alliance as his ridge, his defensive ridge, but he sent his one of his aides, Delancey, to reconnoitre the area, and Delancey actually chose the ridge at Mont Saint-Jean rather than at La Belle Alliance. It's a typical Peninsular War defensive battle on a gentle ridge, with most of his army deployed on the reverse slope, so they're out of view and out of the field of fire from the enemy.
Wellington's not necessarily outnumbered in terms of men, but he's massively outgunned in terms of artillery, right? So the soldiers are going to be protected by that, by essentially being on the other side of the hill.
Yeah. So perhaps explosive shot from howitzers. They can be attacked by that, but round shot hopefully will just hit the hill and bounce over the men's heads. In fact, he instructed the men to lie down a lot of times during the battle. He'd got most of his army deployed on this ridge, but he'd got about 17,000 men deployed much further west at Hal, because he thought Napoleon potentially was going to attack via the Mons Road, and he was particularly concerned about his right flank. He knew the Prussians were going to come in on the left, so his deployment was strength on the centre and on the right. The force at Hal, as well as protecting his right on the Mons Road, also protects the lines of communication with the coast.
And some people often wonder why Wellington didn't build sort of basic fortifications along the ridge, defences, but that's because he wants Napoleon to attack in his position that he's chosen, right? He doesn't want to put them off and get them to, like you say, go around that vulnerable right flank.
Yep, so he positioned, as I say, most of the infantry on the reverse slope. He positioned most of his artillery on the front with instructions not to engage in counter-battery fire with the French, but to destroy the French infantry and the French cavalry.
The one certainty was that the French would attack. They intended to blow the Anglo-Dutch army away before the Prussians arrived. Despite Napoleon's presence on the field, the man with operational control of that assault was Michel Ney, one of the Emperor's bravest marshals, with a temperament as fiery as his distinctive red hair. The Duke of Wellington, on the other hand, was not likely to give such a free hand to his lieutenants.
He was a very energetic commander. He didn't really delegate very well. He sort of micromanaged a lot of the battle himself, and he was often at the crisis point of the battle. When the French heavy cavalry charged, he often found himself in squares, in the British infantry squares, and often moved between squares.
And I suppose if we were to sum up what Wellington wants from his army at the Battle of Waterloo, it's not necessarily elan like the French, it's more kind of iron discipline, right? The ability to stand and endure.
Yeah, indeed. The famous quote, they're the scum of the earth, but he also had a follow-up line of, but what fine fellows we have made of them, which sort of tells you what he thought about the quality of them. There's another quote from when he was in Brussels just before the battle, when he said, that article there, it all depends upon that article as to whether we can do the business or not.
Brilliant. Well, thank you for spending some time with me, Rob. I know you're a very busy man today, but we're going to do our best for you out there.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
After enduring a cold and sleepless night, the soldiers must have been keen to get moving, but there was more waiting to do, with no sign of the French attack. They did their best to dry their uniforms and ammunition in the morning sun. There would be no wandering off now. They'd need to be ready to form up for battle at a moment's notice, never losing sight of the colourful standards which marked out their regiment.
The regimental colours were the pride and joy of soldiers who served in the unit, although by the time of Waterloo, some that had been carried through the major battles of the Peninsular War were little more than tattered shreds of cloth. They provided a rallying point at times of crisis, and they had to be defended at all costs. If a French cavalryman wanted to make a name for himself by taking them, then they had to get past the colour sergeant, who carried a 9-foot pike called a spontoon.
There was a sudden roll of drums along the whole of the enemy's line, and a burst of music from the bands of 100 battalions came to me on the wind, and every regiment began to move. They were taking up position for the battle.
I was soon to get my first view of the army arrayed against us, and though the French were hidden from most soldiers standing on the reverse slope, the veterans in the Allied army were well aware of what they were about to face. French skirmishers, known as voltigeurs, would swarm forwards ahead of any advance to harass and disrupt with well-aimed shots. Massed columns of experienced French infantry would be next, forming mighty blocks in an attempt to overawe and steamroll the enemy. This time, that infantry would include a massive contingent of Napoleon's Imperial Guard, fanatically loyal, elite warriors of the Emperor's campaigns. Literally chomping at the bit to get involved, the French cavalry was probably the finest in Europe, and used well, could be a battle-winning force. Armoured cuirassiers would attempt to bludgeon their way through weak points in the Allied line, while lancers had the advantage of reach and manoeuvrability over the best British horsemen. And then, of course, there were the cannons. Napoleon had 246 of them at the battle, outgunning Wellington's 157. No amount of training or discipline would protect you from a well-aimed cannonball. Under artillery fire, it was pure luck as to whether you'd survive. While manoeuvring to get into position ourselves, it became apparent that the French weren't going to be the only challenge during the battle.
Waterloo was a notoriously hard battlefield to get around. It wasn't just the cloying mud that snapped soldiers' gaiter straps and pulled off their boots. The summer crops were as high as soldiers' hats in some places, making it almost impossible to see where you were going. And when you think that the average height of a soldier at the time was only 5'7", and that of the Highlanders slightly shorter, you can see how it was quite a challenge.
Visibility for Napoleon and his officers was improved by the presence of a 36-foot-high observation tower on the Belle Alliance Ridge, rarely mentioned in modern accounts, but well recorded in contemporary ones. It gave them a better view of Wellington's forces than is often supposed. But the mud was a serious problem, especially for moving the French cannon. Napoleon waited for most of the morning as the ground slowly dried in the morning sun. For the soldiers, it would have been an incredibly tense few hours. Two huge armies eyed each other across the valley, taking the measure of their opponents.
We know that during the Waterloo campaign, some young Frenchmen mocked the Scottish uniform. So a French cavalry trumpeter recorded his shock at seeing kilted Highlanders on the battlefield and thinking that the British cantinières were fighting. They were the women who followed the soldiers on campaign and sold food and other services. But if they were laughing, it wouldn't be for long.
"80 guns fired together, drowning out every other sound. We could scarcely see our comrades, while across the valley, the English had also opened fire. We could hear the whistle of the cannonballs in the air, the dull thud when they struck the ground, and that other sound as muskets were smashed to matchwood and men hurled 20 paces to the rear, every bone crushed.
When Napoleon's Grand Battery opened up to signal the start of the battle, there was uproar on the French side, with cannons firing, trumpets blasting, and regular shouts of "Vive l'Empereur." One rifleman said he thought the French were trying to move us off the ground with noise alone. On the British side, there was stony silence.
The first French attack began at Hougoumont in the west, with waves of blue-coated infantry breaking against the stout walls of the farmhouse. But that was out of sight of the Black Watch, near the centre of Wellington's line. Their main concern would have been the enormous French column forming directly across the valley. Some 17,000 men, led by the Count d'Erlon. Under heavy British artillery fire, this column trudged unstoppably towards the Highlanders and the Dutch troops around them. Even the soldiers who didn't see it coming, given their position on the reverse slope, would have felt the ground vibrating from thousands of boots and heard the ominous pas de charge getting louder, the rhythmic drumbeat that accompanied French attacks. Then came the moment. The Highlanders were ordered to advance a short distance and saw the French cresting the hill, eagles glinting in the sun. The enemy were only 30 feet away. It's easy to see why soldiers of the day engaged in near constant practice of musket drill and manoeuvres, because the battle environment is designed to make you panic. The steel barrel of the Brown Bess becomes almost too hot to hold after 2 or 3 shots. Deafening blasts close to your ears leave you dazed, and watching the enemy level their muskets directly at you is more than a little disconcerting. Soldiers hit by musket balls would rarely fall stone dead, but would have writhed in agony, screaming for help. Maintaining composure and a steady rate of fire in this atmosphere would not have been easy. Keeping the weapons clean was also crucial, and soldiers carried a selection of small picks and brushes to try and prevent misfires. Eventually, after firing dozens of shots, more drastic maintenance measures might be required.
Like most muskets of the day, the Brown Bess became less reliable as the day went on, as it became caked with powder residue that fouled the barrel and the touch hole. The typical way of cleaning it was to pour hot water down the barrel, but nobody was wasting water at Waterloo. Not when urine did the job just as well. Well, I'm not going while you're filming.
Thomas Picton, the eccentric general in charge of the Highland regiments that day, was about to order a bayonet charge when a French musket ball hit him in the head. Wearing civilian clothes because his luggage and uniform hadn't arrived in time for the battle, the ball had passed through his top hat. It was a severe blow. But just as it felt like the sheer weight of French troops might overwhelm the Allied lines, something remarkable happened.
It was a grand sight to see the long line of giant grey horses dashing along with flowing manes and heads down, tearing up the turf about them. The men in their red coats and tall bearskins were cheering loudly, and the trumpeters were sounding the charge. Beyond the first hedge, the road was sunk between high sloping banks, and it was a difficult feat to descend without falling, but there were very few accidents.
Despite the impression given by this famous painting, the British cavalry, including the Scots Greys, weren't advancing over open ground and could only have charged at a brisk trot. Negotiating their own infantry, hedges, and a sunken road, we know that some excited Highlanders grabbed onto their stirrups to join the charge. Hardly possible if they were careering at full tilt. Nevertheless, their emergence through the dense smoke was a nasty surprise for the French. This wall of powerful horseflesh smashed D'Erlon's attack, causing blind panic among the helpless infantry. But fatally, the cavalry continued their advance as far as Napoleon's Grand Batterie. Massively overstretched, they were driven back in turn by deadly French lancers. Roughly half who joined the charge ended up dead, wounded, or captured. This led to a short pause in the battle, with artillery on both sides resuming the duel. Thirsty men would have swigged from their canteens, the bitter taste of gunpowder in their mouths after biting so many cartridges. Beyond the Allied ridge, wounded men and prisoners were bundled to the rear. Supply carts choked the roads, bringing ammunition to the front, and not a small number of Allied soldiers decided they'd had enough and deserted. Marshal Ney, spotting this ragged column moving behind Wellington's ridge, believed it was a general retreat. Another famous cavalry charge was about to be unleashed.
Marshal Ney placed himself at our head. It was 4 p.m. At first, our impact was irresistible. In spite of a hail of irons that beat on our helmets and breastplates, in spite of a sunken lane above which were sighted the English batteries, we reached the crest of the heights and went like lightning through the guns.
Not all French officers were so upbeat, warning of the dangers that would await them over the rise of the hill. 5,000 cavalrymen emerged onto the Allied ridge, expecting to find an army in disarray, but instead they found the British and Dutch infantry in at least 20 densely packed squares. Contemporary accounts reveal that the British soldiers inside these squares were in awe of the huge, terrifying armoured French cuirassiers, surely a common experience for English foot soldiers fighting French knights in previous centuries. Yet they were also in shock at how easily they repelled the horsemen, whose mounts simply would not charge them head-on.
There were very few occasions in the Napoleonic Wars where cavalry were able to break an infantry square with 2 lines of bristling bayonets at the front and 2 lines behind, pouring musket fire into the horsemen. They would always stop at around 20 yards distance. The soldiers were ordered to fire at the horses to cause maximum chaos.
Subjected to wave after wave of these attacks, the Allied squares soon learned that they had less to fear from the cavalry than the French cannons which had been brought up to support them. Every time the horsemen disappeared over the ridge to regroup, the squares made easy targets, with some shrinking into triangles as the ranks were decimated by round shot, then ordered to close up. They left the dead and wounded outside as a macabre barricade. Officers did what they could to keep the men in place, often indulging in gallows humour. Pipers played their part too, with one reportedly stepping outside the protection of a Highlander square to play his tunes, showing utter contempt for the danger around him. As the afternoon wore on, exhausted regiments were engaged in waves by French cavalry, artillery and infantry, occasionally advancing in line to drive off skirmishers before withdrawing and returning to square. And the bombardment grew much worse when the French captured Louee Dessent on the Allied ridge, a critical moment in the battle. Some regimental colours were sent to the rear as they prepared for the worst. But just as it seemed that the British, Belgian, Dutch and German soldiers could take no more punishment, rumours would have reached the soldiers that the Prussians, under Marshal Blucher, were pouring onto the battlefield from the east.
As the battle neared its conclusion, men described the very air undulating as thousands of projectiles ripped into opposing armies. Some said it was like standing at the face of an oven, it was so hot. An officer's orders could barely be heard by the man stood next to him. The smoke hung so thickly on the battlefield that when the Prussians arrived, they had no choice but to fire towards the musket flashes coming out of the smog. For a short while, the Prussian artillery was actually firing at the British.
Despite being ordered not to engage in counter-battery fire, the British hit back, reportedly only realising the error when a flustered German rider emerged from the smoke with an urgent message.
Mein Gott, das ist your friends, the Prussians!
More effective damage was being done by Blucher's men elsewhere, behind Napoleon's army at Plancenoit, where a major attack was sucking in thousands of French troops. In Napoleon's final gamble, he ordered 8 battalions of the Imperial Guard to advance on the Allied slope. It was a desperate attack, only a third the size of the one launched by d'Erlon's corps earlier in the day. But there was no other option. In any case, the Guard were undefeated, les immortels, and to see them approaching was impressive and terrifying in equal measure.
Their red epaulets and crossbelts put over their blue greatcoats gave them a gigantic appearance, which was increased by their high hairy caps. When I saw the imposing advance of these men and thought of the character they had gained, I looked for nothing but a bayonet in my body.
British musketry put the Immortals' reputation to the test. Some troops lay down in the crops until the French were close, then sprang up to deliver a terrifying shower of lead. The fighting was chaotic. Allied forces drove back the Guard with bayonets levelled, but then found themselves shot to pieces by French cannon. Along the entirety of the ridge, Allied soldiers were engaged in this final, furious French assault. But then, quite suddenly, the resolve of Napoleon's Immortals snapped. At one moment, densely packed ranks of soldiers were trading desperate volleys. The next, Napoleon's men were disappearing into the smoke. Wellington ordered a general advance towards the French ridge with a wave of his hat. As the remains of the Anglo-Dutch army vacated the positions they'd held all day, witnesses recorded the huge number of red-coated corpses and wounded they left behind, lying in neat rows where they'd stood in formation. Those who had survived unscathed could scarcely believe what was happening. The battle was almost over.
No language can express how the British army felt at this time. Their joy was truly ecstatic. The French at length ran off, throwing knapsacks, firelocks, and everything that was cumbersome, or that could impede their flight.
Estimates are the best we can do when it comes to the total losses at Waterloo, because the units involved weren't keeping detailed records in the aftermath. But it's reckoned that of the 3 armies who took the field, some 200,000 men, around 90,000 were unaccounted for in the following days. Now, a huge portion of those were deserters, but it's thought around 50,000 were killed or wounded, a devastating casualty rate.
The Black Watch had lost 5 men killed and another 45 wounded. Serious enough after the horrors of Qatre, but not the worst butcher's bill at Waterloo. Of the 747 men serving in the 27th Inniskilling Regiment, almost 500 would lie dead or wounded that night. And the suffering would continue long after the final shots were fired.
You were almost better off being killed on the battlefield than lying wounded. When news of victory reached London 3 days later, there were still injured men being carted off the battlefield at Waterloo. Lying there at night, the locals would creep onto the battlefield and try and take healthy teeth from young victims to use as dentures. For years afterwards, dentures became known as Waterloo teeth.
Wellington would go down in history for his famous victory, while Napoleon's glorious career had reached the end of the road. He was captured attempting to take a ship to the United States and banished to the island of St. Helena in the remote mid-Atlantic to live out his remaining years. The fortunes of the thousands of ordinary Waterloo veterans would vary widely, but many who had suffered through the trauma of the battle would feel a sense of burning injustice at the lack of recognition back home. They would live with the scars, mental and physical, for the rest of their days. None would forget what they'd done or what they'd seen. Thanks again to the 42nd Highland Regiment 1815, the Napoleonic Association, and organisers of the Battle of Waterloo 2025 for making this episode possible. Please subscribe to the channel and like and comment on this video to let us know what you think. If you want to learn more about life in Napoleon's army or the British 95th Rifles, then check out the videos on screen now.